Thank you so much for this opportunity to present my work. I'm glad to be back. Like Andrew mentioned, I was a student here and I have really fond memories of UC Irvine, especially the sunny weather. So I'm staying in Boston, in Cambridge right now, and it's supposed to be raining today, and then tomorrow it'll be snowing again. And this is just a wonderful respite. I can't wait for spring to come in sooner, so that I needed to go here to experience the sunny weather. Again, thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to share with you some findings from my research. This presentation concerns the phase out of USAID's contraceptive donations to the Philippines. I will discuss the effect of this phase out on the birth rates in the country, and also the previous administration's decision not to purchase contraceptives when the phase out occurred and how that impacted fertility. Before we go on to discuss the specifics of the setting in the Philippines, I'd like to mention something about the global funding paradigm for family planning in the developing world. In 2012, about $4 billion has been spent on family planning programs, and this is only in the developing world. And much of this amount is paid for by international donor agencies who give some money to different developing countries so that they could support their family planning programs. A huge part of that is spent on contraceptive supplies. So these are in-kind donations given to these different countries for pills, IUDs, injectables, condoms, various supply-based methods of contraception. But then again, there's an open question whether those donations and those subsidies are actually effective in helping to reduce fertility. In some settings, in some work, especially in Indonesia, they tracked what happens to pregnancy rates and also contraceptive usage when subsidies get reduced. And they find in that setting that it hardly mattered at all. Higher prices or lower subsidies and also lower incomes of families after a crisis in Indonesia didn't result in any change in contraceptive usage. So that says, in that setting, there probably isn't a tight relationship between the subsidy given for contraceptives and fertility. However, other work, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, show that when funding for family planning programs were cut because of the so-called global gag rule, wherein funding for services to promote abortion and the like were cut around 2001, that led to higher pregnancies and higher induced abortions in those countries. I aim to show in this research whether that kind of finding extends also in the Philippine case, and to learn more about the dynamics surrounding these issues. So I will start with a brief summary of what transpired in the Philippines. Since the 1970s, the Philippine government has been receiving contraceptive supplies from international donors, and that is primarily USAID, the United States Foreign Aid Agency. And these in-kind donations, they distributed in their public health facilities for free. One thing you need to know about the Philippines is that it's predominantly Catholic. And so this is a touchy issue. However, the government is happy to receive some support on the family planning program, but not really willing to spend money on its own. In the late 1990s, USAID gave the government of the Philippines notice that it was going to graduate the country from receiving commodities support. This was part of a broad worldwide effort to encourage country ownership of family planning programs. The administration at the time took this development in stride, and they made plans to assume funding responsibility for contraceptive purchases. So there was that plan to for the shortfall to fill in the gap, the supply gap that will ensue. However, before the phase-out even started in 2004, a new administration unexpectedly came into power through an uprising. So that new president, who was closely allied with conservative groups, i.e. the Catholic Church, threw out that previous plan and instead directed local governments to finance the purchase of contraceptives on their own. Many local governments, however, were cash-strapped, as in many developing countries, the smaller local governments don't really have that much spending capability, and they were ill-prepared to take this responsibility, and not a lot of them did. So, I will try to answer three main questions in this presentation. First, did the phase-out of free contraceptive supplies result in higher birth rates? If you think that the answer has got to be yes to this question, that may well be the case. But note that couples and women could take actions that could offset the loss of access to free family planning supplies. Some of this include buying contraceptives from the private sector, especially if it's vibrant and existing. And in this case, in the Philippines, at the time of the phase-out, a quarter are already purchasing their supplies from the private market. So there is that substitution possibility that exists.
Which is illegal.
Women and couples could also choose to switch to other methods of preventing births. For example, inducing abortion, which is illegal in this country but very pervasive. They could also undergo sterilization. They could use traditional methods like withdrawal or periodic abstinence, also called rhythm or calendar method. And finally, people could perhaps even consider reducing sexual activity. But maybe that's not the ideal scenario, right? So all these behavioral responses change the likelihood of childbearing in different ways. And so determining the fertility impact of the phase-out is altogether an empirical question. And I will present time series, cross-sectional, and panel data evidence for that purpose. The second question is, do short-term supply chain issues affect birth rates? Above and beyond the reduction in the supply of free contraceptives induced by the phase-out, supply chain inefficiencies that induce short-term changes in supply could discourage adoption by new users on the one hand, and also discourage continuation by current users on the other. I will show how provincial birth rates and women's pregnancy risk responded to transitory changes in the supply of free contraceptives. So this is one issue in the family planning program literature that many people come back to. It's the importance of the supply chain infrastructure for delivering these family planning commodities. But not a lot of work has done looked at this carefully. What are the consequences of those supply chain, erratic supply chain behavior, where sometimes there is a shipment, maybe a big one, and then the next time around there is not, or the chain in various stages in the supply chain don't work as effectively as the other stages. The third question I'd like to answer is if there was any effect of changes in contraceptive supply in the public sector on birth rates, which groups were the most affected?
82 provinces. Observed from 2000 to 2008.
So the main data that I assembled was a complete panel of the country's 82 provinces, observed from 2000 to 2008, consisting of the following variables. I use administrative data on the quantities of different contraceptives shipped by the Department of Health to different local government units each year. These contraceptives consisted of pills, IUDs, condoms, injectables, and I combined them together using what's called the couple years of protection that each method provides. So for a single year, it is assumed that a woman would need about 15 cycles of pills to get protected for that whole duration. If it's injectables, it's generally taken every quarter, so there's 4 that needs to be available for the year.
And for condoms,
If it's IUDs, it's once inserted, it's good for about 3.5 years, so it's effective for about 3.5 years after insertion. And for condoms, believe it or not, there is a standard number for this, 120 for a year is usually the case to provide 1 full year of protection.
And also the proportion of women.
I also used the number of registered births from in each province from the vital statistics system of the Philippines, and also the proportion of women aged 15 to 49, the childbearing ages,
using that information
in each province, which I estimated from the 2000 and 2007 censuses using interpolation.
For a full year supply of contraceptives from the public.
Using that information, I was able to track the share of women of childbearing age who had provisions for a full year supply of contraceptives from the public sector. And this is going to be on the left axis, vertical axis. That's the share of women 15 to 49 with full year contraceptive provisions. So we know that the donation phase out happened in 2004, and I confirmed from the administrative data from the Department of Health that this indeed happened.
However,
the shipments of contraceptives from the central warehouse to the different local government units dropped substantially starting in 2004. However, using a different data source, and this would be data on women reporting how many of them used contraceptives and where did they obtain that contraceptive from. I would be able to check for trends in contraceptive use from those surveys, the so-called Demographic and Health Survey and the Family Planning Surveys in the Philippines.
So up until 2005,
and what I found was that women's use of contraceptives from the public sector began its decline only in 2006. So up until 2005, the share of women of childbearing age using free contraceptives was steady at 9%, and that is very much in line with the supply numbers before, so it's still 9%, but then again it only dipped in 2006. So you may be wondering why the lag, the 2-year lag, and that is because of the long distribution pipeline in the country. This distribution pipeline starts from USAID, shipping the in-kind donations of the condoms, IUDs, etc. to the central warehouse in the capital city of Manila. And from there, it flows from the central warehouse to the different provincial warehouses. And from there, then, it goes to city and municipality health offices, and then finally to hospitals, village health facilities, and village volunteers, which are at the front line of the reproductive health services. So what this means for my analysis is that I have to account for a lag between contraceptive donations from USAID, shipment to the OH, and then to any eventual impact on fertility. Because I only captured data at the first level from DOH to the local government units. The timing the lag would happen because of this long distribution pipeline. So one thing you need to note here is that shipment delays could occur at any stage of the supply chain. Because of budget issues, each stage is responsible for the transport of the commodities to the next stage in the supply chain. This problem is aggravated by the country having an island geography, so that shipments sometimes need to go through the sea, and also difficult terrain in certain areas. So what you need to add to this 2-year lag is a 9-month pregnancy period, the gestation period. So that one could expect that full impact on birth rates to happen only after about 3 years.
using
So
the
now
orange line,
we're ready to
and
answer
this
the
is
first
scaled
question.
by the axis on the left,
I repeat the annual
And
trend
now
of the contraceptive
overlay
shipments
the annual
to the local
birth rate,
governments
which is the number of
using the orange line, and that is being scaled by the axis on the left. And now I will overlay the annual birth rate, which is the number of births per 1,000 women of childbearing age. Using the red line,
in the birth rate since
that is scaled now by the axis on the
that's
right.
red line. But this was reversed.
It is clear from this graph that there has been a downward trend in the birth rate since 2000, and that, again, that's the red line. But this was reversed starting in 2007.
This shows that at least in the short
And
term, birth
this
rate
is 3 years after the start of the donation phase out in 2004, and it stayed in that same level the following year. This shows that at least in the short term, birth rates increased in response to the cut in public contraceptive supply to that big cut there. Note that the latest available vital statistics data, and that would be for 2009, shows that the birth rate went down to 75 in 2009, slightly below the level in 2006. And this could be related to the emergence of several mitigating circumstances, such as the receipt of emergency supplies from the United Nations Population Fund, and also the belated compensatory behavior that some women might exhibit afterwards. So,
sorry, can I ask a
sure.
question? This last slide. So prior to 2000, it seemed the birth rate had started falling,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps independent.
So for
of,
sure there is this downward
contraceptive
trend
supply, but I
over
don't know. Are
time,
there other
which could be because
factors
of
that are driving
urbanization or
the decline in birth rate in
areas and
this period?
the social acceptance.
So for sure there is this downward trend over time, which could be because of modernization and many people going to urban areas and the social acceptability of contraception being higher in those areas, and various other factors like more stable incomes, because in fact during this period of time the economy was growing, and so all of those factors help in reducing the demand for children. This is time series evidence. The next few things that I'll be showing would be cross-sectional and then panel data, which are able to account for all the different factors that are happening at the same time. Either as a control variable, I include them and see if the effects persist. And also, I put in fixed effects that take care of things that are invariant but specific to each province. So this is just a first rough check at the data, where we see an effect, possibly true, and I am able to verify with additional analysis that that seems to be the case even with controlling for the other important variables that we care about. Mm-hmm.
I have also another quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
This is not exactly a crude birth rate, because the denominator is women 15 to 49.
I can,
but it is a sort of
some
crude
other
rate.
analysis, which I
Do you
have in other slides,
are
but
you
I
able
won't
to
be able to
calculate
show.
like a
I
TFR
can
or
get each
something
specific
like
birth rates, and so I can.
I can, in some other analysis, which I have in other slides but I won't be able to show, I compute the age-specific birth rates, and so I can sum that up to get the TFR. It's very much the same findings would come up from
There
this.
was still an uptick.
Yes. It would just look like it's slight, because TFR movements are kind of slow in this sense, but there was still an uptick in the same canal.
Analysis takes advantage of the varying size of the supply cuts.
So moving on to the cross-sectional variation available in the data, this cross-sectional analysis takes advantage of the varying size of the supply cuts in the different provinces. As you can see in this map, all the provinces except for 3 experienced drops in the average share of women with provisions for free contraceptives. So I've scaled the quantities that were donated by the number of women who would be in childbearing ages in those areas. And you can see that Most had negative changes, of course, and it varied from about 0 to at most
So in
12.5%.
this cross-sectional analysis,
That's in real
compare
absolute
changes in
terms,
birth rates in each
not
province
12.5%,
against
that's
corresponding
percentage
changes
points. This is
in public
percentage
supply.
points.
Taking
So in
into
this
account
cross-sectional analysis, I would be comparing the changes in birth rates in each province against corresponding changes in public contraceptive supply, taking into account different potential distribution and inventory lags.
Econometric stuff that I have in
And so
other
this
slides,
is
but
the kind
I
of
need to
intuitive
go through
picture.
them.
In everything that I will be showing here, I have all the fancy econometric stuff
But
that I have in other slides, but I won't really go through them. You're free to check the paper or ask me later on for those. But the things that I've found are pretty robust to many concerns that we worry about when you control for them. Here, I just want to show that on the horizontal axis, this would be the change in the average supply coverage from the public sector. And you can see almost everyone is on the left of 0. So there was that reduction, big reduction in 2004. I think averages over 3 years around that 2004 baseline, because we know that supplies are coursing through the supply pipeline, and there are inventory levels too, so that it doesn't really follow that what you want to look at is the current shipment, but the string of shipments that have been happening in the past few years. So I'm looking at the 3-year averages. On the vertical axis, for all 3 graphs, that would be the change in the average birth rate. For the first panel, that would be the following year. So remember, we have that gestation period. So it has to be that the corresponding changes in birth rates would be the following year. And that assumes away any distribution and inventory lag. The other 2 panels actually incorporate that. And in all cases, we see a negative relationship between the 2. So these are showing that the provinces which experienced the biggest reductions in supply, so the ones at the leftmost part of the graph, they also had the increases in birth rates. While provinces which did not have much of a reduction in supply, so nearing 0, they continued to register declines in birth rates. So they are still following the trend. But if you look at the intermediate cases, around 0.6, 0.06, the intermediate cases with medium reductions in supply had smaller declines in birth rates than on average. So it seems like the increase in birth rates is for those who were facing the biggest reductions in supply. And for all the others, the decline in the birth rate was slower than it was before.
So the more influential observations are the bigger provinces in this regard.
This means what?
It's proportional to the population of women of childbearing age. So the more influential observations are the bigger provinces in this regard. And the red line overlaid is the regression slope.
Yes.
And that would be uncorrected for the various controls, right?
Is it weighted by?
It's it's a weight. The slope, the regression is weighted by the population of women of childbearing age in each province. Yes.
Public contraceptive supply and changes in birth rates was highly.
So this is just a summary of what we saw in that graph. The negative relationship between changes in public contraceptive supply and changes in birth rates was highly statistically significant. You have to take my word for now, but it is in the paper. It's highly statistically significant, and it did not go away even after I controlled for many important economic and population factors that could affect birth rates on its own. I also tried omitting outlying areas. So these are the areas which are the least or the most developed provinces in the country, and the same relationship holds. The same statistical significance holds as well. This confirms the finding we saw from just looking at national trends over time.
that are time varying at a provincial
And
regional
just
level.
so you know what all of those control variables that I included,
Their expenditure.
that would be different economic
Wage
data
rates that
that are time varying at a provincial or regional level, including income of households and their expenditure, and also the wage rates that people face in the agricultural sector.
Which, if you think,
Importantly, I also control for spending per capita by each province on health, nutrition, and population programs, which, if you think they might respond to the loss in support from the national government, you would want this to be in that picture. And again, results get smaller, but they remain to be statistically significant with the addition of those variables. I also include baseline population characteristics, demographic characteristics from the 2000 census, percent married, Catholic, literate, education shares, and everything holds significant even after controlling for those. So I guess you might be wondering what is the size of that effect that I found. And the effect I'm showing here is after controlling for all those variables. So this picture tries to give you a sense of the magnitude of the effect that I saw. Before the phase out, about 90 out of every 1,000 women of childbearing age obtained their contraceptive supply for free from the public sector. And that is represented by the blue circles over here. So it took quite a while to put up all these 1,000 circles here. Don't worry, it was fun, but trust me, there's 1,000 of them there. And 90, the blue ones would be about 90, and they were the ones who were getting it from the public sector before the phase out. On average, for these 1,000 women, 82 of them give birth per year. And that's represented by the orange dots at the bottom.
Here, 50 circles represent the women who lost access to.
So now focus on the red circles and red dots in the graph. So the red circles here, the 50 circles represent the women who lost access to free contraceptives after the start of the phase out. And you can see at the bottom 3 dots that out of that 50, 3 of them eventually gave birth after a certain number of months. So remember that this effect is net of any offsetting actions that couples and women may take to compensate for the loss of free contraceptives. These additional births, when you tally it up, they add up to about a 4% increase in the birth rate. That would be about 77,000 additional births per year because of the supply reduction that transpired.
I now take advantage of the quarterly data on the shipments of these.
Now we're ready to move on to the second question, looking at the supply chain inefficiencies. I now take advantage of the quarterly data on the shipments of these contraceptives in the provinces. And I am showing here 4 example provinces, all starting with A, just to pick a random set of them, their names starting in A. And you can see that shipments went up and down over the whole period, from 2000, even before the phase out, from 2000 up to 2008, up to the end of the phase out. And it happened in an irregular manner, and differently so in each province. And this can be traced to various supply chain issues that included sometimes receiving the donations from USAID late, sometimes having some inventory miscalculations, wherein they thought that the supply was still there in the warehouse, but when they looked, it was all gone. Or maybe they thought there wasn't any more, but there was still some in the warehouse. So these things I was able to surmise, or actually heard from the supply manager that was responsible for the supply schedule, shipment schedule. One other thing that happened during this time was that there was a bundling of shipments. Remember the different stages? They want to save on transport costs and effort, so that sometimes there was supposed to be already a shipment, but then again, they would wait out.
The managers.
Also, these shipments come in boxes, so it's not easily divisible. So again, that kind of incentivizes the managers to save on transport costs and effort to maybe just wait out and ship it in bundles.
Then one should also find birth rates.
So the key thing here in this quarterly analysis is that if birth rates really responded to the supply of free contraceptives, then one should also find birth rates exhibiting the same pattern and the same fluctuations that would mirror that of the public supply level after some lag again, but in the opposite direction. So if there was a sudden increase in supply shipment, there would be thereon sudden decrease in birth rates. And conversely, if there was a sudden drop, there would be a sudden increase in birth rates. And in fact, in the statistical analysis, that's what I found. This was true, and the magnitude of the effect turns out to be similar to what I just showed earlier.
I continue to find the same.
Moreover, when I separately teased out the effects of sudden public supply increases from sudden public supply decreases, I continue to find the same strong negative relationship. Supply reductions are followed, as I thought it would be, by higher birth rates, and supply increases are followed by lower birth rates. So at first we were just looking at the broad reduction, but here we're able to check whether the results hold for a movement in either direction, either a ramp up in the supply or a drawdown. So in terms of magnitude, for every 1,000 women of childbearing age, when 60 of them suddenly lost a quarter's supply of free contraceptives, this resulted in almost 1 additional birth per quarter, so 4 on an annualized basis. So compare that to about 3 that we saw earlier for the effect of the supply phase-out. In the same manner, when 60 women suddenly obtained or suddenly got a quarter's supply of free contraceptives in their province, this resulted in almost 1 averted, 1 less birth per quarter, which again adds up to about 4 evaluated. These results underscore the tight linkage between birth rates and public contraceptive supply, which answers our question too. What I'd like to point out as well is that the difference in this panel data analysis is that I don't compare a province against another province. The comparison I'm making is each province compared against itself, looking at what happened to it in different time periods, and then pulling the estimate of that effect across all 82 provinces. So all the things that you think might be inherently endogenous about a province, being maybe it's more likely to experience such a reaction to such a shock, they're accounted for in this type of fixed effects panel regression estimation. I also continue to control for various economic variables in commodity prices as well to better proxy for local conditions. So prices in each province of about 62 different food items I included there, and things are about the same.
So the
hold the same statistical significance and the same point estimates.
And we're moving on to right now is the women level analysis.
So the final part of the puzzle, or at least the third question I'm interested in, and
7,000
we're moving on to right now, is the women level analysis. So this analysis uses the pregnancy history of 7,000 non-moving women interviewed in the 2008 demographic and health survey. So they were asked how many kids they have had and when they've had those kids over their whole reproductive lifetime for all those different women who were interviewed in 2008. So this data source would allow one to look at differences in effect by women's background. So everything that we were looking at, we're at the aggregate level, but now we can look at the background of these women who could have been affected by this supply phase-out and supply fluctuations. This is useful in tackling the question of who might be the vulnerable groups.
In public contraceptive supply.
And the finding here is that any given woman was more likely to get pregnant if her province saw drops in public contraceptive supply. So in terms of magnitude, again, a 5 percentage point drop in supply led to a 16% increase in a woman's chances of getting pregnant, and that's for everyone. However, when we start zeroing in on particular subgroups, we're able to see that certain women had even higher risk of getting pregnant when their province saw drops in public supply. So these are women that live in rural areas. So the pregnancy risk that increase is 20% for them, compare that to 16% for the aggregate all women.
55% higher risk.
For the poor, which is categorized the poorest 20% of the population, they faced 55% higher risk.
Higher with a 5%.
And finally, for the less educated, the ones who have not even attended high school,
This means that women from this
their pregnancy risk was 40% higher with a 5% increase in or decrease in supply. This means that women from disadvantaged backgrounds were disproportionately more likely to experience having the unintended
Take
births.
away from this presentation. First, the reduction in the supply of contraceptives. The broad
In summary, here are the main points that I hope you can take away from this presentation. First, the reduction in the supply of contraceptives, the broad reduction, led to more births and unintended pregnancies in the short term. And I would hasten to say in the short term because when we get in more data, we might be able to see some adjustments that happen for some of these women. Number two, the sudden increases in public contraceptive supply from the supply chain inefficiencies, they've led to less births, while sudden decreases led to more
I guess you
births.
might be wondering what evidence.
And finally, the poor, the less educated, and the rural women were the least able to cope with the supply gaps.
So that's the main point here.
And I guess you might be wondering what evidence exists for the limited compensating behavior that underlie these results. So that's the main point here. People have various adjustment margins that they could undertake, but even then they weren't able to fully compensate for that loss in supply. So here again are the margins that I talked about earlier, and these results are more suggestive, if anything, because the data isn't really that precise and that much available in a disaggregated level to be able to see for sure whether these things are the things that happen accompanying the supply phase out. But suggestive evidence says that in terms of having less sex, actually yes, people seem to have had less sexual activity
in terms of induced
because after the supply phase out, but then again, because of the birth increase, that means that that wasn't enough.
How about private sector substitution?
In terms of induced abortions, probably. In terms of sterilization, there wasn't no change in that. How about private sector substitution? Maybe some people would be willing to pay for their own contraceptive supplies from the private sector, from buying it from the pharmacies and putting up their own money for it, and that doesn't seem to be the case. What happens though is that there was more traditional usage, so people were shifting when they lost the supply from the public sector. They were considering using withdrawal and periodic absence or vending method. And just to show you the numbers, so by different age groups, sexual activity didn't change much for the young, but for the middle age and the older women,
This also says that
from 64% to 61%, sexual activity went down, the same for the 35 to 44-year-olds. This also says that the additional births were not likely due to people just having more sex. Because mechanically, if that was the thing that happened, then that could be the driver here. But that I find the opposite.
Revolve around births, but also about all pregnancies that women.
Now, in terms of induced abortions in the DHS, survey, the question just didn't revolve around births, but also about all pregnancies that women have had since they've been 15. And using that information, I'm able to plot for the sample women in the survey how many pregnancies they've had. And if you can see, around 2006, there's a general downward trend, but around 2006, there's the uptick, which resulted in births a year after. So these are conception dates. Okay, so this agrees with the vital statistics data that I used earlier. So this is some sort of a robustness check. But then again, if you take out the number of pregnancies that ended in live birth so that you can come up with the number of terminated pregnancies, that would be the bottom figure here. And suggestive evidence, again, just looking at the graph, says that around 2006, there is also again a downward trend in that number of pregnancies that ended in stillbirth or induced abortions or spontaneous abortions. But then again, in 2006, that went up. And that could be, again, due to the supply phase out.
And you can see that
in terms of contraceptive usage, the orange line says how many women were saying they were using supply-based methods. And you can see that it didn't actually change much. In total, when asked at the time of the interview how whether they were using contraceptives, either from the public or the private sector. One thing before we move on to the other side, you can see that sterilization, there wasn't really much action there. You would expect that maybe it would have increased, but not quite. So let's hone in on what happened to the supply picture if you break it down by the source. So women were asked, where did you last obtain your supply from? Whether it's from the public or the private sector. And this is the number that we see. It may appear at first that there was some switching from the public source to the private source from this graph around 2006 onwards. But note that private usage has been growing unabated since 2001 up to the last data point in 2008, with a seemingly consistent pace all throughout. And because there is the absence of increases around 2006 that go beyond previous trends, that suggests that there was little switching of supplies from the public sector to the commercial market. So if you're looking at trends, it seems like this is just a general trend, and these women may not necessarily be the ones shifting to that private source. So where are they going then? They are switching to private sources. And the statistical analysis confirms this, that the shift was coming from public to traditional and not public to
on the evaluation of family planning programs. Many papers have written a lot about.
So in terms of the paper's contribution, it adds to the literature on the evaluation of family planning programs. Many papers have written a lot about the effects of the introduction of family planning programs, which is important. But then again, right now, almost all countries have some sort of family planning program in place. And so that might be considered not as relevant. What could be relevant for in this literature now would be looking at differences in implementation intensity and how that affects people's behavior, especially if the private sector is there and available for them to shift to when public support runs out. So this shows the effect of such a program rollback. It also shows the effects of weak supply chain management. That's the quarterly variation fluctuations that I was showing earlier. And this work uses actual program inputs. So other work has used campaigns. The start of a certain campaign, these are really broad events, or maybe the setup of a family planning clinic in a certain area, without really dwelling much on how much supply support went into when those family planning clinics were established, how much support were they getting through the years. Okay? So this moves the literature a bit further. And the other thing is we have well-measured variation that is coming from the administrative data that we were able to take advantage of. And it also adds to the literature on the sensitivity of take-up.
deworming
to
pills,
positive prices,
insecticide
to non-zero prices of welfare-improving goods and services. So you might have heard that for
there are subsidies
deworming
in the
pills,
developing world
for
those
insecticide-treated bed nets,
But
for
when those
water
subsidies
chlorination
are
tools or
people,
devices.
end up not
There are subsidies in the developing world
even
for
though
those
it's really
health-improving
for their
goods.
children's health.
But when those subsidies get cut,
So
people
I'm extending the
end up not
by saying that
buying them,
also applies
even
to
though
children.
it's really important
So
for
that
their
thinking
children's
about
health
your,
and even
fertility
survival.
in this setting,
So I'm extending the literature by saying that it also applies to contraceptives. So that thinking about your fertility in this setting is pretty much sensitive to that availability of free supplies as well.
Especially mentioned with UCI Public Health
And I'd like to acknowledge the many people who have helped me while I was doing this work, and many organizations that have supported me. And I'd like to especially mention the USAID Public Health Program, which provided me travel support in 2010 when I started working on this project, and that enabled me to visit the Philippines and be able to talk to a lot of people and appraise the interest in this topic. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thanks for such a clear and important presentation.
Thank you.
There are other reasons why people use contraceptives, including trying to prevent STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And I don't know if you ask questions about that in terms of what people would do when the free supply is no longer available, but they're not really concerned about having children.
So
They're
most
more
women in the Philippines start from childbearing around age,
So that's one question, and then
Okay.
or at least that's the
Okay,
median.
thank you for that question.
And so it's
So the-
quite early.
Most women in the
for them,
Philippines start
and
childbearing
so a lot of
around
people who are
age
using contraceptives
22,
are already committed.
or at least that's the median. And so it's quite
It's
early
true that especially
for them,
fathers
and so a lot of people who are using contraceptives are already in committed
The
relationships.
thing is,
Um,
in this context, I mentioned condoms.
It's true that especially for condoms, that's also used for STD
It
prevention.
was pretty very small.
The thing is, in this context, I mentioned condoms in the context of the whole different panoply of methods,
But in terms of
but it was
HIV,
pretty small, very
it's one
small.
of the countries, the Philippines, is
So
one
it
of the
affords
countries
little
that
protection
hasn't had much
in terms of the population.
high HIV.
But in terms of HIV,
and
it's one of the countries, the Philippines is one of the countries that hasn't had much a high HIV rate given its demographics.
social norm.
And people, some of people attribute that
Not a lot
to
of them are using it for that purpose, I would.
what's this, circumcision being the social norm in this country. So it's not a lot of them have been using it for that purpose, I would say.
So you would
Yes,
project that
and in fact, in the surveillance studies that they've been doing,
there might be an increase.
there is an increase in HIV rates, but only in select areas.
Yes, in fact, in the surveillance studies that they've been doing, there is an increase in HIV rates, but only in select areas, and those areas would be where there are call centers, but not in the general population.
So my second question is about the lag phase. I don't know what the life expectancy of the, well, again, condoms in this case, I know you did more, but if 3 years passes between the supply and it trickling down to the user, I wonder if you might also be seeing
Expiring shelf life. We're talking about shelf life.
because
Yes.
the condoms that are now
So most of the
being
specific commodities
are
that
no longer
were being
effective.
shipped
Right.
had a shelf life of 5 years.
Expiring shelf life. We're talking about shelf life. Yes,
Still within
yes.
the lab working.
So most of the specific commodities that were being shipped
The numbers
had
that
a
I
shelf
have
life
here
of 5 years.
are probably
So
overstated in the sense
still
that
within the lag that I'm working on, but definitely that's a concern. And the numbers that I have here are probably overstated in the sense that there could be leakages of that sort. Some expiring later on because they weren't being properly taken care of in inventory, but also because there could be corruption. So basically I'm looking at that initial shipment, but I would guess that results are going to be adjusted a little bit if you account for those kinds of adjustments. Yes. Yes?
I'm just wondering, are there other like demand-driven or randomized control trials to complement your study? I find it like they're really interesting.
Right. So
development
other studies, yes,
independent
there
ORS,
are about 3
other, you know, where they control
RCDs,
different substances.
but they've
What
been
is
done in the
the more
1970s,
plus?
80s. So one
Right,
type
so
A,
other studies, yes, there are about 3 RCDs, but they've been done in the 1970s, 80s. So one in Taipei, one in MATLAB, Bangladesh, and another one in Rongo in Ghana. And there they have family planning programs being established in certain areas, but not in others, and done in a randomized fashion. In those settings, they've seen birth rates go down quite a bit in those areas where those programs were introduced. And so that is kind of the part wherein people believe that introduction of these programs do indeed help reduce fertility. But yeah, in this setting, like I mentioned, I kind of tried to move the needle a little bit away from just introducing a program, but now looking at implementation intensity, how it changes over the course of that program, and maybe even its eventual termination. And I didn't go into much in this presentation, but my argument is that in effect this, and this could be illustrated in this graph, that the phase out was supposed to happen using the schedule on the top panel for pills and injectables. So it was supposed to be gradual based on consumption in 2003. But what happened when I got the data and looked at it was that they were shipping it idiosyncratically, it seems. And in the sawtooth pattern, so it was completely not smooth. And also sawtooth, so that there was increased decrease. And so I argue in the paper that this is kind of unexpected in that sense, some sort of randomization. In the sense that first it was unexpected and it was tied to the average consumption level.
According to the rule.
So if
let's say 50,
so that just means that the absolute amounts of the reduction varied according to the rule. So if let's say 50% women have provisions for supply, and let's say let's have a 50% cut, so that would be a 25 percentage point cut, right? For those provinces, but for the others, let's say for a 10%, it will be a 5%. So it all followed this certain rule that was not related to anything else.
Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that.
So I didn't get much into that, and I'm sorry if this kind of throws you off a bit, but yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that with you later. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This is an interesting speech. So I have 2 questions. One is going back to the start of your speech. You say that there's there's wondering whether the effect of contraceptives really is redundant in Indonesia, but in your case, it's different, a different story.
Right.
So what do you think is the difference? Is it just because you have better data, or is it really a broader institutional differences? And the other question is that now that the responsibility of supplying a supply shifts to the local government, is there like local policy adjustment, like we're not providing free, but we're trying to fund private sector, so we provide not entirely free, but
I feel like it's an entirely different institutional setting, for sure.
Right.
One thing
Okay.
is that when
So in comparison to the Indonesian study, I feel like it's an entirely different institutional setting, for sure. one thing is that when,
It's
first of all, in Indonesia they have a very strong family planning program with strong backing from the government.
contraceptive commodities.
And
Here, these are
the main tool
so
is
it's
subsidies.
either there
So
is
it's the
supply there,
rate of subsidy for the contraceptive commodities. Here, these are quantities. So it's just either there is supply there is commodity there, or there is not. While there, the change was, it was higher priced now, and maybe later lower priced.
The social norm.
Okay, so the margin of changes, I would say, is starker in this sense. And also, the social norm seems to be that women are more receptive of contraception in Indonesia than in the Philippines in terms of levels. Prevalence rate of contraception is much higher there than in the Philippines. So with regard to the second question, so what are the local governments maybe doing afterwards? So some of them, with support from USAID projects, have been exploring their own financing mechanisms, and maybe their targeting mechanisms as well, wherein
using this list of poor households,
poor women would be getting the targeted supply
for the limited money that they have.
using this list of poor households in a certain province. So USAID has provided technical support to enable local governments for the limited money that they have to be able to target the ones who needed the most.
Conservative.
But in general, what happened after was that this president I was talking about was very conservative. There is a new president now, who is more receptive to putting again big support for the family planning program in the Philippines. And there is legislation that has been recently enacted that would mandate provision of these supplies, free supplies for women, which hasn't been implemented yet, but they are moving in that direction already. So I hope I answered your question.
We do have time for more questions individually, but before, while we still have
Thank you
some
so much for
people here, let's thank the speaker again.